What's interesting is in July of 2022, the Center for Countering Disinformation, an entity that belongs under the presidency of Ukraine, published a blacklist. And I'm on the blacklist as a Russian propagandist. I'm an information terrorist, and I'm a war criminal. But one of the things that they listed 3 reasons why I was a war criminal and information terrorist. And the first one was that I was saying that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict was a proxy conflict between NATO and Russia. So I fully anticipate that the Ukrainian Minister of Defense will now join me on the blacklist because he is obviously a Russian propagandist, because he is pursuing a pro-Russian narrative and saying and having the gall to say that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of NATO against Russia. I said the truth back then. Now Ukraine has no choice but to admit the truth because they're in a desperate situation. They can no longer play games. They have to call NATO out because NATO has set Ukraine up to fail. That's the tragedy of this whole thing. NATO and the West do not care about Ukraine. They do not care about the Ukrainian people. They don't care about the Ukrainian soldiers. They are more than happy to let them continue to die on the battlefield because the West will never support Ukrainian victory. I mean, they'll do it rhetorically, but they'll never give them the resources necessary because, simply put, Ukraine cannot beat Russia. It's physically impossible for a nation the size of Ukraine to defeat a nation the size of Russia. It just won't happen. But the West continues to fool Ukraine into believing that's a viable mission. Go ahead and do it. But we know what the West's intent is. It's not to have Ukraine emerge victorious. The West has already said Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. Never. Never be a member of NATO. It's just not going to happen. And yet Ukraine thinks that somehow, if they continue to sacrifice, NATO will welcome with open arms. The European Union gives lip service to Ukraine joining the European Union, but the European Union can't absorb an economy that no longer functions. $1 trillion of damage to the infrastructure. It's going to cost even more than that to bring Ukraine back up, if it ever can be back up. So Ukraine will never be a member of the West. Never. Never, ever, ever. It isn't going to happen. And yet the Ukrainians continue to die, believing that somehow it is going to happen. It isn't. The West is sacrificing Ukraine for the sole purpose of harming Russia. That's all. They don't want to help Ukraine. They don't like Ukraine. They want to destroy Ukraine. And that's what's happening. And finally, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine is saying the truth. Hey, guys, we're doing your dirty business. It's not a dirty business that just happened. Remember, Angela Merkel, Hollande, the former French president, Poroshenko, all say that the Minsk Accords of 2014, 2015 were a sham. A sham. They didn't want peace. They wanted war. They wanted to buy time so that NATO could train a Ukrainian military that would be capable of confronting the pro-Russian separatists or rebels in the Donbass and liberate Crimea. Meaning war, war, war. That's what the West wanted from day one. This was a proxy conflict from day one. The proxy conflict predated Russia's decision to intervene militarily on February 24th. It predated the 2014 fighting in the Donbass. It predated the decision to invite Ukraine in 2008. It goes back to the lies told by the West to then Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand if Russia left East Germany. If Russia voluntarily left East Germany, withdrew the 400,000 troops, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. That is a direct quote from James Baker, then Secretary of State of the United States of America. We lied then because our policy has always been to exploit Russian weakness, to contain Russia, to undermine Russia for the purpose of having Russia collapse. That has been our objective from 1990. It's our objective today. And we're using Ukraine as the sacrificial lamb to achieve that objective. Unfortunately for Ukraine, Russia isn't playing that game. Russia's not rolling over. Russia's winning. Russia's going to win. Russia will prevail. The West will fail, but Ukraine will die. Yeah, you can't, if you call yourself a Ukrainian nationalist and you support what's going on today, you hate Ukraine. It's as simple as that. You hate Ukraine. You say, how do we solve this? I'm going to be brutally honest here. There's some problems that can only be solved with a bullet. When people have imbued hatred into their very existence. And remember, the Ukrainian nation is defined by its hatred. The modern Ukrainian state is defined by its hatred towards Russia. They're taught from the very beginning to call the Russians Moscow, which is a derogatory term. They call them orcs. The followers of Stepan Bandera view the Russians as subhumans. They slaughtered them during the 1940s and 1950s. 200,000 Russians, 110,000 Poles. These aren't good people. And you can't rehabilitate them. There's some you can. The non-believers, the people who have inadvertently been sucked into this situation. But the true believers, the ones who tattoo the swastika on their hand, who say Sieg Heil, who march, who murder, who shoot Russian prisoners of war, who speak about, wanting to kill Russian children. There's only one solution. That's the bullet.
So sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they made the decision. They made the decision. It's a conscious decision on their part to do this. We all come into the world equal in the eyes of our Creator. Children are not born evil. Children are born innocent. And what a child turns into as an adult is a direct byproduct of the environment that they are raised in. Let's take a look at your average Russian boy. They're not perfect. None of us are. No boys are perfect. We all know that. Boys are little devious little creatures growing up. But we're not evil. We want to do good. You give a boy a chance. If somebody falls on the ground, will the boy laugh or will the boy go over and try and help the person up and assist them? And generally speaking, they will seek to help because they're programmed to do good. And your average Russian boy, young man in uniform, wants to do good. They don't want to hurt people. I mean, if called upon to fight, they will fight very well. But when they capture a Ukrainian, they treat them with respect as a human being. They offer a cigarette. They offer water. They treat the wounds. They say, do you want to have a phone call home? Not to mock their loved ones, but to give them the solace of knowing that their loved one is alive and will live and will survive this war. What did Ukrainians do? They kick them. They mock them. They shoot them on sight, or they beat them up, put them in a cell, torture them even more. When they call the family to brag about killing people, about torturing them. They want to call family to make the family suffer. This isn't done. This doesn't happen by accident. And the fact that it's so widespread in Ukraine means that your average Ukrainian man has been programmed from childhood to believe this is okay, that Russians are subhuman, whereas your average Russian man has been programmed to treat the Ukrainians with respect, as co-equals, as fellow human beings. Yes, we can find deviations. I know for a fact there's Russians out there who are ultra-nationalistic nature, who call the Ukrainians ho-ho, and they speak to them about pigs and wanting to fry the pigs. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. But it's in isolation. It's not reflective of the Russian totality. Whereas in Ukraine, the exception is the Ukrainian who speaks of the Russian well, who speaks of the Russian as equals, who speaks of them as fellow human beings. And most of those Ukrainians have an aspect of Russia in them, whether they are ethnic Russians themselves, whether they have parents or relatives that are Russian. There's something about them that lends itself to understanding that the Russians are human beings and co-equals. But the other Ukrainians, the nationalists, the ultra-nationalists, they've been programmed from very young to hate Russia and everything about Russia, and therefore torturing a Russian, taking an ethnic Russian, taping them up to a pole, pulling down their pants, painting their face green, and mocking them, leaving them exposed to the elements to suffer is okay. And There's Ukrainians here in the United States who say it's just a pat on the butt. It's not a big deal, meaning when they spank these people, it's just a pat on the butt. It's a huge deal. It's a human rights violation, and it just shows a mindset that treats these people as it's something less than human. And when you have that in the head, how do you get it out? When the brain is so infected, how do you change it? And under Khrushchev, because this isn't the first go-around with Russia against this ideology. In the 1940s, late 1940s and early 1950s, the Banderist movement, the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists, was engaged in large-scale resistance against the Soviets in Ukraine, in Poland too. They were defeated. Thousands of them fled and created diaspora communities in Canada and the United States and Australia and elsewhere, where this Bandera ideology festers today. Today, 60 miles away from me in Ellenville, New York, there's the Heroes Park, where they have a statue of Stepan Bandera and 4 other Nazis, people with blood of Jews, Poles, and Russians on their hands. They call them heroes. Every summer, the Ukrainian youth gather there, Ukrainian American youth gather there. They wear uniforms that are direct replicas of the Nazi uniform. They have the Nazi salute. They carry the portrait of Bandera, flag of Azov. These are Nazis in America. They're sick people, mentally ill people. They exist in Canada as well. In Canada, it's even more mainstream. Their deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, is a Nazi. She was raised as a Nazi. And she's there today promoting Nazi ideology in support of Ukraine, who exists here. Russia militarily defeated this ideology in the 1950s. Those who didn't flee were imprisoned and subjected to political reprogramming. And then instead of serving a 25-year sentence or a 10-year sentence or a 15-year sentence, they were released, paroled, brought back into society and said, look, it's over. The past is the past. But it wasn't over for them. They lied to the Russians about reprogramming. Instead, in their basements and in hallways and in dark alleyways, they continued to organize and plot with the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency, which continued to fund this movement all the way up until 1990. They're there. They're festering. They hate. They represent nothing but hate. And now today, if you're going to denazify Ukraine, that means you have to have a solution for these people. Now, I don't want to be too crude here, but the best solution is they all pick up a weapon and go to the front line and get killed. That's the best solution. It's the easiest solution. Self-termination. But some of them are going to get captured. The Russians already have a solution for that. They have imprisoned many of these activists. Now, if you're guilty of a crime, you'll be tried in a court of law and held accountable to the rule of law. But many of these activists are being given a second chance. Denazification. And the Russians are honest about it, meaning they're giving them an opportunity to try and redefine their life, acknowledge the mistakes, etc. But, how many times do the Russians have to be fooled? Are the people that are denouncing denazification doing so because they truly believe in renouncing the hateful ideology of Stepan Bandera? Or are they doing it to survive? Will they say anything just to get out of the situation that they're in? That's what they did back in the 1950s. There's no guarantee they're not going to do that again today. I'm not advocating that Russia kills prisoners. I'm not advocating that Russia does anything inhumane or in violation of international humanitarian law. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to reprogram people. In Germany, in the aftermath of World War II, the ideology of National Socialism, of Nazism, survived in the basements of the homes of many Germans, where they had shrines to the past glory. They weren't allowed to take these symbols out of their home, parade them in the street, but they did it in secret. And this is the future of Ukraine for any one of these Nazis who survives this conflict and doesn't flee or isn't killed. They're going to take this ideology into the basement, and it's never going to die. So that's why I say the only true solution is the bullet. So I'm hoping that every single one of these true believers puts on a uniform and goes to the front line and is given the opportunity to die for their country.
why did Putin do this? Okay. And as I watch the assurances that Putin sought, the promise that he didn't get, and the threat not only of continuing destruction of these Russian speakers outside of Russia, namely in Ukraine, but also the prospect of this NATO-trained army, NATO-trained in the past 7 years, attacking Donbass, Donetsk, and Lugansk, which it appears they were about to do. I think that I can understand, okay? I can understand why Putin decided the only solution here is for me to clean these guys out and take back Donetsk and Lugansk and see what else happens. Do I have allies in this? I do. Xi Jinping, he couldn't pick a better ally, and so he went ahead. So people say to me, McGovern, shall you think that's all right? Look, what I say to them is this. I think Putin, like any president, considers his main duty and first and foremost duty to defend his country from outside aggression. I have to say we give him that. That is a major objective of his reckoning. So, here's McGovern. Why don't we try to be a little empathetic here and put ourselves in Putin's shoes, okay? And I watch all this activity going back to the coup in Kiev, 2014, and I see the encroachment of NATO closer and closer to the east, despite promises in the past not to do that. So, what's the bottom line for me? I say to my friends, no. I don't want to be a hypocrite. Hypocrites are not nice people. So if I was sure, well, let me put it this way. If I were Putin, I'm not sure what I would have done. When you're president of a country and you see an existential threat, and you have the power and the potential to react to that threat, that's what you do. That's what John Kennedy did on Cuba. Was the blockade legal? No. Was his assembly of an invasion force prepared to go into Cuba legal? Not so much. Was his threatening of nuclear war legal? Well, UN says you're not supposed to do that. But nobody said, Mr. Kennedy, what you're trying to do is unprovoked. It was provoked. And that's the way I look at Vladimir Putin. I think that when we have to be honest here and say that we provoked him into these measures. And you can talk about the morality, you can talk about how terrible it is that people are suffering. I feel really bad about that. I honestly do. But the corollary here is that if you want to stop this, if you want to have a ceasefire, you have an imbalance of power in that area of the world where the Russians have most of the power, then you got to figure out why they did it, okay? Why Putin, what motivated Putin to do this? And once you figure that out, then you can meet and negotiate, for God's sake. That's the way we used to do it, and that's precisely the way we did it on Cuba, and there are no high-level contacts worth mentioning now that things have gotten so bad between Russia and the United States. In my view, people like Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are exceptional people. That is, people who have been given to believe they are exceptional. They've attended the finest schools. They've been given the most wonderful privileges. They are precisely the same kinds of people that advised John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson to go into Vietnam because we were exceptional. The French couldn't beat these ragged, barefoot jungle people, but We are exceptional. We could. There was a book written about it. It's called The Best and the Brightest. So you'll have the direct descendants of those people. They come from the same Ivy League schools. They have no real experience. They never wore a uniform. They don't know what war is like. This is very dangerous, okay? Joe Biden, does he know what war is like? 5 deferments during Vietnam. How many did Cheney have? 5 deferments during Vietnam. Well, okay, nothing against deferments, but the fact is Joe Biden doesn't know what war is like either. Luckily, every Russian that was in on those discussions with Khrushchev 60 years ago on Cuba had been in World War II. That's big. The Russians, as your listeners may know, lost 26 million people plus in that war. Imagine that, 26 million people. Everyone, even today, has a relative, grandfather or so, that had the experience of real war at the hands of the Nazis, okay? So, deciding on Cuba, when Khrushchev said, look, we know what war is like. This guy Kennedy seems serious. It's not an existential threat for us. It's a political embarrassment to withdraw, but let's keep our heads screwed on right and get those missiles back home. And that was the decision. He didn't face any big backlash for that. They were sensible people. Now, there is a sense that's drummed into you if you're exposed to war. And unfortunately, the people that are now calling the shots in Washington have no concept of this. John Kennedy did. So did those around him. They had served. They knew what war was like. Not the same way that the Russians did, but they knew. Kennedy, of course, himself was in that Peachy boat. So this is a big difference, and it gives me great concern that these people who think we're exceptional and that the Russians are, well, you know, when I speak at universities very often, people ask about, well, do you think the United States of America is indispensable, like Madeleine Albright and other people, high statesmen have said? So I always say, well, what's, you know what a synonym is? And most of them say, yeah, that's a like word. They said, okay, well, how about an antonym? And one or two of them said, oh, yeah, that's an opposite word. So I asked them, okay, so what's the antonym for indispensable? And they stroked their chin, and usually one of them said, whoa, dispensable? I say, that's right. So, if the United States is indispensable, by definition, all the other countries, Brazil, all the other countries, especially Russia, are dispensable. Now, there was a time where the United States could get away with that. That time has ended. The only problem is that these exceptional people don't realize that no longer are we indispensable. We're not even exceptional, except for the fact, and mark my words, this is very important, except for the fact that the world has now been divided into, people talk about multipolar world. Well, in a sense, they're quite right. But I look at it as a world not unipolar as it was ever since World War II with the U.S., the main pole, so to speak. It's bipolar in both senses of the word, all right? In psychiatric sense as well. But in the geostrategic sense, it's bipolar because on the one hand, you have the lily white West, NATO. Look at them. They're all lily white. The closest you get to people of color is Turkey, okay? The lily white West against the rest of the world, primarily people of color. China? India? Iran? Argentina? Brazil? South Africa? So would our policymakers in their indispensable way say, Russia is isolated? Well, I hope they don't really believe that, but I have to allow for the likelihood that they do. Why? Because we're exceptional, we're indispensable. Russia is sort of like an Untermensch, pardon the expression. And of course, a lot of the Russians are people of color as well. So just to sum this up, it's a very dangerous situation we're in right now, because what China and Russia call the collective West, which is lily white, is arrayed against the rest of the world, including not only China, India, Russia, and many other countries who are fed up with this unipolar thing. You can call it multipolar if you want. I call it bipolar.